Welcome to another month of Skill Builders. My name is Joanne Knight.
And I'm Joyce Lundergan. We're glad you're here. This month's quilt is so cute, and we've selected a log cabin block with fabric color placement that creates a heart, and have chosen to use designs that follow the theme of the quilt, but ignore the piecing to show that patterns don't necessarily have to fit the piecing. We've used a pattern with a heart design, and you can see the heart here in this block and also out here in the border. And the pearls in that pattern create kind of a cross your heart design through the center of that block. Sometimes the simplicity in pattern choices or the simplicity in the number of elements used provide continuity and balance. We used just 3 patterns on this quilt, but using Creative Studio features, we've combined them to create blocks here in the center, frame around that center block, and border. So we've used this pattern here. We've used this wedge pattern, which is similar. It's a different design, but it's the exact same shape as the wedge that we used last month. And we used an apply stitch, even though it's designed really small. We're excited to show you how we can make these patterns work for small borders that we have. We want to do something other than place pearls. So before Joanne starts with these outer borders, then I make a quick mention on Stitch in the Ditch. We've given you a quilt group called Stitch in the Ditch. I've stitched the Stitch in the Ditch around the 3 borders. I stitched around the blocks here, around the outside of that inner border, and then on the inside of this outside border. The other nice part of having a quilt group where you do just Stitch in the Ditch, because we're using draw line here, then it creates a pattern, of course, but when we roll the quilt and we need to line up our bottom half of the quilt, then when we place our machine head on, for instance, this outside inner border, and we place the machine head there after we've rolled, if our crosshairs line up with what we've already stitched on the top half, then we know that we're rolling the quilt square. We like to have stitching points on. I have this in my menu strip. You can also get to stitch in points by the drop down stitch. And the last thing before you do the Stitch in the Ditch, you should make sure when you're loading the quilt that the seams for all of those borders are lying flat. The extra couple of minutes to look and check your pressing and making sure that when you lay it on that those seams don't get twisted is always a good idea. So Joanne, we're ready to get quilting.
Now that Joyce has talked to you about what our design concept was and how we approached this little wall hanging, and it is really easy to make into a lap quilt or a larger quilt. So if you be sure and go back to the newsletter, you can see that. I'm going to tell you about the techniques that we're going to go over for this month. We're going to look at log cabin borders, which is another type border that comes in handy if you don't have a corner to use or you have just a little small border. We're going to talk about copy and paste and rotate and divide for the sides of this wall hanging that we're doing. We're going to talk about creating corners from point to point patterns. We're going to talk about placing the wedge block patterns, which are these really pretty feathers right here, and which ones you quilt first and which ones you quilt second. We're going to go over this little 6-inch center right here and how you create that pattern, because if you look at your patterns that we gave to you, which are a ton, you don't see that pattern. So we're going to show you how to create that. Then we're going to touch on echo just a little bit and jump stitches. So we've got quite a lot that we want to go over for this month, and so we think that it's time to play. When we talk about log cabin borders, we're referring to this little outside border and the little inside border that you see in the pink here. And we're going to be using an apply stitch number 19 to do that, which may or may not be something that you would think of to use in a little border, but it's set up perfectly. I'm going to switch to the LC Borders quilt group, and I'm going to talk to you just a little bit about what we mean by log cabin borders. You can see if I select this top border right here that it is inset just a little bit from the left side. You see on this left side how it's set in? If you have one of those good Statler habits and you remember to inset this left side, then when you get down to the bottom or you're doing the sides, you don't have to stop and remember how you put that in if you do it the same way every time. They sort of butt up against each other as they go around, and it makes for a really fast piece and a really cute way to do this. So let me show you how we set this up using this little apply pattern. I'm going to delete everything that's on the screen, and I am going to click out a boundary, and I'm going to show you a picture of where I started clicking that boundary. There are of course a couple of different ways that we can place these repeats in this boundary, but if we used apply, it would put them too close together and make them a little bit too dense. So instead of using apply, we're going to use repeat pattern. I have my machine head at the upper left corner of my boundary. So I'm going to go to repeat patterns, and because the pattern starts up at the left and it's also the upper left corner, but I'm going to change it to start point, and I'm going to click OK with the machine head. That's going to place that pattern in there, and you're going to see from the size that it's really small. This little outside border is 1.5 inches, so I'm going to say give me 1.30 in height and move my mouse to the screen, and I'm pretty happy with where that sits because I want this pattern to just barely touch this inner seam line. I've already done the stitch in the ditch, so I know that this is pretty straight. I don't want them this close together. So I'm going to uncheck freeze aspect, because if I leave freeze aspect on and I change the width, it's going to make them taller and they're not going to fit anymore. So I'm going to take freeze aspect off, and I'm going to go with a width of 1.75 and move my mouse to the screen, and I like what that looks like. And that's just a matter of preference. So now I'm going to lock my repeats and rows, because I'm just going to add repeats all along here, and you can see that my size is staying the same. I'm going to add repeats until I come close to the end of that boundary. If I add 20, then I'm over. So let's do 19, and I'm going to stretch them ever so slightly, because I would rather stretch them than to divide them or pull them in a little bit. Once I've done that, I'm going to say OK. I'm going to select these repeats, and I'm just going to pull them just before I get to that boundary, because you're going to have some shrinkage here. And I'm going to look at this, and I'm liking what I see. I will turn my stitching point on because I want it to hesitate a little bit whenever it gets to this little line. You will also notice where the top basically of the pattern is. You see this little top right here that makes kind of an arch? When we do the inside boundary, you'll see that it's flipped the opposite way, and then that way we create kind of a border for this little 3-inch inner border. So with that done, I'm going to select these patterns and I'm going to copy them just like that, and I'm going to go ahead and stitch these out because that will stabilize that. Once I do that, I will come back to you and I will draw a boundary on this right side. So hang on just a minute and let me stitch those out. We've got those quilted out, and I have drawn a boundary on the right side for what my sewable area is. And you can see that it butts right up against those patterns that I just got through quilting. So I'm going to left click on copy, and I'm going to hit my space bar until these patterns rotate around, and I'm paying attention to where that little arc is. And I'm going to place them right up in that boundary. I'm going to use my Alt key, and I'm going to nudge them up, and I'm going to nudge them over to the left side. Now, I obviously cannot quilt all of these, but I do want that copy of them. You see how it extends all the way down? And it doesn't make any difference whether you start with the right side or the left side. I just happen to pick the right side. So I'm going to choose the pattern, because when you copy it, it combines it. And I'm going to go to nodes, and I am going to hover over that little top of the arc, and I'm going to hit the letter D on my keyboard, and I am going to toggle these patterns below my boundary as sewn. It's a little bit of chunking here, so I'm going to quilt these out. I have those patterns quilted out on the right side, and it's really easy to tell which patterns were quilted because of the boundary that was drawn, even though everything is red as if it is sewn. I have drawn a boundary on the left side, and it is starting at the upper left corner, and I am going to paste by doing a left click on my menu strip. I'm going to hit my space bar one time, and I'm going to left click, and then I'm going to right click to stop that function, and I'm going to move this pattern into that boundary that I have drawn there, making sure that it fits like it needs to. Move that over. It's easier to do that while it is all one piece. This pattern ends at the top because of the orientation. So while it's still one complete piece, I'm going to select it, and I am going to left click on reverse start and end, and now it starts at the top, which is where I want it to start sewing. I'm going to select the pattern and go to nodes, and I'm going to look for a pink node, and I'm going to hit the letter D on my keyboard. Now I'm going to toggle this as sewn that is below that boundary, and I will quilt these out, and then I will come right back to you. That side's quilted. Now I am going to once again hit the paste, and this time I'm going to hit my space bar and rotate the pattern around, because remember, we want the little arcs to be at the bottom. Left click to stop and place that pattern. Right click to get out of paste. Because I am using a copy of the top, then I don't have to be concerned about whether the density matches, because it is the same. I'm going to pick up these patterns, and I'm going to just slide them into that boundary that I drew, and I am going to hit the nodes button, and I'm going to divide this right here and delete this last section. If yours doesn't fit exactly like this, then you of course can just manipulate it a little bit if one of them is a little bit over, and just adjust these patterns the way that you need them to be. Now, because I'm a left to right person, I'm going to select them, and I'm going to reverse the start and end. It doesn't really make any difference where they start and where they quilt on this one. I just have a right brain, left brain thing. So I am going to quilt these out, and all of this is done in this one quilt group, so it's real easy to see how those patterns need to be oriented. Then at the same time, I have quilted everything in my sewable area that has to do with these patterns before I ever roll the quilt and get to the patterns that are on the bottom. So let me quilt these out. I've rolled my quilt, and what I need to do now is relocate, and we like to relocate in the center because that way we can see how much shrinkage is going on, and it's very little with this little pattern right here. I'm going to select a pattern, and it doesn't have to be the one that I'm going to click when I relocate, and I'm going to right click, go down to relocate, shift all to one point, left click, and I'm going to click that little point in that pattern right where my machine head is with a left click. Then I'm going to say yes, that my machine is in that location, and you're going to see that Creative Studio will line everything back up. This is a reminder that boundaries do not move. So I'm going to hit my delete key and get rid of that one and get rid of the other two by selecting them with my K or my L key and hitting the delete key. Everything is toggled as sewn. But if I select this pattern and then I select the one below it, you can see that the one below it is all one pattern and it's a taller height. So that tells me that this is the one that I sewed and this is the one that I have left to sew. So what I'm going to do is draw a boundary for this little right side and put that pattern in there. So I'm going to left click on draw my boundary and do that right quick. I'm going to left click on paste and I'm going to hit the space bar, making sure that the orientation of that pattern is correct, and I'm going to left click and place it in there. Now remember, this pasted copy is still this top row, because remember this one right here we had to shorten, so we still want it to be the top row. It ends on the top, so I'm going to select it and I'm going to reverse the start and end. I have to be sure that this pattern is oriented the same way that this inner one is, and I'm going to scroll in and I'm going to go to nodes, and I'm going to hit the letter D on my keyboard, toggle the bottom part of this pattern as sewn, and now these patterns are ready to sew out, and I can do that. I went all the way to the belly bar on this one, and I want to sew this on the right side and the patterns on the left side. Then I'm going to go back and put in my 3-inch border. So I am doing as Joyce did and coming to the center of our quilt right in here, because I want to place those patterns. But I want to have all of this stabilized before I get to that center. So let me quilt these out and I'll real quick show you how I draw the left side. Now here's the left side. I'm going to paste again and I'm going to rotate it, drop it on the screen, right click, and I need to be where I can work with it a little bit. So I am going to place that pattern. Now I almost messed up, you see. Those are oriented the wrong way, so I'm going to hit my space bar and rotate them around because I need them to be the same as the other patterns are on the inside. Let me pull those down ever so slightly. Those look pretty good to me. I'm going to select them and I am going to go to nodes, and even though I can quilt this one, I think I'm going to do the divide here because that boundary is a little close right there, and the last part of the pattern actually goes over, and remember this is to the belly bar, so I don't want to take a chance on shrinkage and it hitting that belly bar. So I'm going to toggle this one as sewn, and now that that one is toggled sewn, I can quilt this one out and then I can put in my 3-inch border and go to my center. We'll be changing quilt groups in order to do that, so this group will stay fine just like it is, and whenever I get down to the bottom, all I simply have to do is relocate these patterns, and I will show you how to adjust those. I'm at the bottom of our Heartfelt log cabin, and what I want to do is relocate all of these patterns so that they will be in the correct position. So I've gone back to our log cabin borders group. I have placed my machine head right at the ending point of this pattern right here. You see where my height is 1377 on that one, and the height on this one is 2035, and it's also one complete pattern. So it's easy for me to know which one I sewed and which one I didn't. It will probably be easier for you to toggle this pattern because that makes it so much easier to select this point and not get confused and select the wrong one. So I'm going to highlight a pattern in a different location so that the handles don't interfere, and I'm going to right click and I am going to relocate shift all to one point, and I'm going to click this little ending point right here, and I'm going to say yes, that my machine is at that location, and you can see it moved all the patterns up. I'm going to hit my K on my keyboard, and I'm going to delete these boundaries, and I'm going to select this one and toggle it back sewn, because what I want to do is put the patterns in for the bottom right down here. I want to place those patterns first because that will stabilize the quilt, and it will make it so much easier to adjust the patterns on the right side and the left side. That's why I said it's really easy if you have the same offset every single time. So what I'm going to do is go in here and draw a boundary of that bottom outside. My stitch in the ditch has already been done, and that stabilizes everything. So let me draw that boundary right quick. And that's okay that these patterns are over your boundary, because remember the inside is going to be shorter than what the outside is. But let's don't get confused about those. Let's go ahead and just hit our nodes, and let's get rid of some of those patterns so that they're not confusing. We know we have more than what we need, so I'm just going to select those, and I am going to delete those just so that I have a better visual. Don't be concerned about these on this side that are sticking over a little bit, because that's shrinkage, and that's where that's come into play. If you turned your machine off, you would not still have a copy of what your pattern is. So just go back up to the top border, hit your copy again, and I'm going to hit paste, and I'm going to hit my space bar to rotate that pattern around, and I'm going to place it in that boundary just like that. And you can see that my bottom border is not the same as my top border, but that's okay because these patterns are easily divided to be able to get rid of them. So that's what I'm going to do. Part of it is shrinkage and part of it is piecing. So I'm going to hit nodes, and I'm going to get rid of this one right here and take it out of the way. And I'm going to look at those patterns, and I think they look pretty good in that boundary. So now I am ready to quilt those out. What I want to do now is complete the right side and complete the left side, and then do the center. And the center is going to be done the same way. And this is not too bad. This is my last pattern that I sewed, and this is my next set of patterns that I need to sew. I have drawn a boundary. I'm going to toggle these as unsewn, and instead of taking these and moving them up, I think I'm actually going to pull them down a little bit. When you've got 23.42 inches, That's a lot of repeats for that to go through, and you can see that I need to adjust them ever so slightly, or I need to lean on the quilt a little bit. But basically what I'm going to do is just divide out this pattern right here, because I know with shrinkage, this one's already past my boundary, so with shrinkage it's really going to be past my boundary. And I'm going to go in here, I'm going to move my crosshairs until it is right at the end of this set of patterns right here, and I'm going to adjust these and sew them out, and then I'm going to draw the boundary on the other side and I'm going to sew that out. Then I will do the inside. Log cabin borders are just so easy to do, and they really are forgiving. So next up, we're going to talk about the border, and Joyce is going to show you how we did this 3-inch border right here and how she made the border corner, and then we'll come back and do the center.
Now let's address the 3-inch border. Back in August when we did the placemats, we had a pattern that was designed for a square, so that if you were to click this pattern using draw pattern with grid snaps on and click diagonally in a square, then it fills the spot. So in August we showed you how to create borders and corners. So just as a quick refresher, and for those who are new to Skill Builders, let me review that process of taking one of those patterns that are designed for a square and point to point, and how to create borders and corners. We're going to use these patterns in this 3-inch border, so I have set my grid at 3 inches. I have snaps on, I have the pattern selected, and I'm going to click on draw pattern and click in the lower right of one of the grid squares, then click upper left, then click the upper right of the square above it, and then the lower right of the adjoining square. Right click and right click again to close and exit. Now you can see we have created an L-shaped corner, and I can select the pattern, right click, save pattern, and we'll call this SB Heartfelt Cabin corner. And I will click corner so that I can find that again. Uncheck point to point because it's not a point to point pattern any longer. It's a corner pattern. And then save and close. So now that's been added to our project. Now to get the repeat to go with that, all I need to do is to select these two patterns, the top two patterns, which will start on the left and on the right, and I have flags on, so I will delete this bottom one, and you'll see here's the repeat. Select the pattern, right click, save pattern, and we'll call this SB Heartfelt Cabin border. And I can add in point to point and leave point to point check, click border, and save and close. So now we have both the corner pattern and the repeat that we need to use for this quilt. And we can use these patterns for using border corner feature as well as drag and drop and apply. So I'm going to click on the corner pattern first, hold down Control key, select the border repeat, and then click on border corner. And follow the prompts on the screen to click the boundaries. Our May Skill Builder project, we did extensive border corner for you, and we showed how to set up using border corner, how to chunk or how to turn, so I'm not going to go through all of that. I am clicking the outside 4 points and the inside 4 points as prompted on the screen. And remember to always carry the machine down to your belly bar. Next, it's going to ask us to enter the border length. Don't try and enter it up here under this box, because even though you can try to type into it, it won't do anything. So make sure you set total size length here. This is 33 inches that I measured. Bring your cursor over to this CAD and it will accept that. Now I have set my machine up and the quilt top so that I can reach the halfway point. When my machine is down at the belly bar, that's further than the half point of the quilt. And half of 33 inches is 16.5. You can measure and see by selecting those side repeats and the corner. And it shows that it's 16.47 inches. I think pretty much even the people with classics will be able to do the top half and then the bottom half, as well as everyone with a larger throat space. I am happy with that. You'll see we gave you the project with a 0.03 margin, so it fit it pretty closely. I'm going to click OK because I'm happy with the setup. And I like how well it has fit here on the side, left side and the top. I'm going to select the right side with the corner though, and using Alt and my left arrow, I'm going to bring that a little bit closer to that inside border. And now you see we broke the connection here, so it's not continuous. So I'm going to select those top repeats, press F11 for my ends, handles, and with snaps on and endpoint checked, I'm going to just snap that right side back. Things to consider if you're going to stitch this all at once are whether you're double batting and have to consider extra shrinkage. This is pretty small quilt, and we have stabilized both the outer and inner with stitch in the ditch. I stitched this all continuous and it set in perfectly, but consider whether you're using double batting or on a large project, you may want to select some of the repeats on the right hand side, toggle them sewn, sew the left hand side first, and then you use your crosshairs and click new boundaries if necessary to adjust the right hand side so that you don't get there and find that because of shrinkage you're going to run into the edge over here or aren't close enough to the inside border. So with that set up, we'll move on to the next step. Joanne?
For the center wedge patterns, we're going to put those in point to point. But the difference is we're going to start with the center patterns first because we think that it's more crucial where they meet and make this intersection and this secondary pattern right in the center of the piece. We're going to draw good boundaries and we're going to work on those first. So let me go to our wedge quilt group and I'm going to click out those boundaries and I'll show you what I'm talking about. You can see that I drew a boundary and I made a little mark where the center of the two blocks are. If we look back at our picture, right here is where I'm talking about where it makes that secondary design. These patterns are designed to fall outside of this 6-inch center, but it may be a little confusing about where that 6-inch center is. And I want to draw a boundary of those too, but what I'm going to do before I do that is I'm going to go ahead and click out my point to point, and then it will be easier for me to see just where I need to draw that boundary in case I need to adjust these patterns. So I have my pattern selected, and I'm going to left click on Draw Pattern, and with the head of the machine, I'm going to click out these patterns. Notice the direction that I am clicking, and that's because that's the way the pattern is oriented. Go over to this side and click that side. I'm going to close the drawing and I'm going to exit the drawing, and I'm going to quilt these patterns first. But before I do, because of the piecing, you see how these patterns are not quite in line right here? So I'm going to go a step farther, and I'm going to put my crosshairs, even though I have that boundary, I want to put my crosshair right in the center of that piece. Now you can easily see how the left one is a little bit higher than the right one, and that's the clicking and the piecing. So I'm going to select this one, go to F8 handle, and I'm going to very carefully pull it down so that I have it going pretty much right there to that center. And I'm going to pay attention to this one and make sure that they are oriented almost exactly the same way that they need to be. When you use your F12, be careful not to mess up those pearls, and they will stay connected. You see I have my markers on, and they will stay connected. Now I'm going to go back and draw the boundary for this center for this 6-inch square, and then I can quilt these out because I'm going to quilt them first and then place the top two. I could place them all four at one time, but I'd prefer to quilt out these two and make sure that shrinkage doesn't come into effect. You see how I'm drawing my boundary right here to check those feathers? And I did a closed drawing, but just as a reminder, remember that once you close the drawing, I can come over here and click out another boundary. While I am still in the drawing function. So now I can close the drawing and I can exit the drawing, and I can either hit the letter C on my keyboard to get rid of those crosshairs so that I can see better, or I can just scroll in and look at these feathers, and they look pretty good to me. So I'm going to go ahead and quilt those out. I've got those quilted out. My pattern is still selected, so I'm going to go back to Draw Pattern, and I am simply going to continue clicking in the same motion, which is clockwise. I'm going to click where I left off on that left side seam. I'm going to go up to the point on the seam line at the top, and I'm going back over to that right side, and I'm going to close the drawing, and I'm going to exit the drawing. And what I'm going to do is check these corners and make sure the corners are exactly where I want them to be, so that that little point is exactly in the corner, just by manipulating it ever so slightly. Make sure your snaps are off whenever you do this. Just like that. I can see that I'm a little bit close into that boundary on this one, so I can move the pattern up, and see if I do it with F9, it changes the connection and it breaks that connection. But it's really easy to just select the pattern, do F7, turn my end snaps on, and snap it right back in place there, and snap it right back in place there. I can do that, or I can lean on it a little bit. Let me get this one, go to F8. We've told you before that F8 is the easiest one to adjust those with. So this is what I'm going to do, and I'm going to quilt these out. This one looks like it went over into my boundary. It really didn't, but about a stitch, and I had to lean on it about a stitch. And that's fine. Just pay attention to it whenever you are quilting that out.
The quilt's coming along really quickly and is so cute. What we have left to do for the top half of the quilt is the center of the log cabins. To do that, we're going to use that SB Heartfelt Cabin point-to-point square pattern again and create a block. I have my grid set at 3 inches. I'm going to turn snaps on and make sure that grid snap is on. And with the pattern selected, I'm going to click on Draw Pattern, and I'm going to click across these grid squares. They're 3 inch. And I'm clicking in a clockwise manner. When I get back to the start, I can right-click and right-click again to exit drawing. Now this is the block that we used, but you could also click in a counterclockwise direction to create a second block with a different look where the pearls would go into the center instead of outside. So click on Draw Pattern again and click counterclockwise to see how differently the block would look. We can select each of these and save them as their own pattern to use in a different quilt. We decided that we thought an echo around the outside of the block would be really pretty, and we chose this first block because it mirrors the look of that 3 inch border. So I'm going to select this pattern on the right where we clicked counterclockwise and delete that. So now I'm going to select this pattern so that I can echo it. But remember, this is 4 individual patterns. So if I click on 4 individual patterns and then click on echo, nothing happens. It's like, what happened? Nothing happened. That's because echo can only echo a single object. So with the pattern selected, I'm going to click on Combine, then select it again and go to Echo. Now we chose to have the spacing at a 1/4 inch. Remember, if you used a different echo spacing in a prior project, the last time you used it, it may come up and the default might be 0.15 or it might be 0.50. To change the spacing, just click on the plus or the minus. It defaults to outside. This is the look we wanted. Pay attention that there is a jump stitch here. If you have stop at jump stitch selected in your controller definitions, which is the default, then it will stop, and if you have tie off on, then it will tie off. I'm going to click OK to close this setup box. I want to use this pattern using repeat patterns. So we need to save the pattern to our project and to our pattern database if we like. So we'll select the whole pattern. We don't have to click on Combine before saving it. Saving the pattern will automatically combine it. It won't take away the jump stitch. The jump stitch will still be there. I'm going to right click, save pattern, and give it a name, SB Heartfelt Cabin block. I could even say echo in case I wanted to save the other portion as just the block. It's not point to point, it is a block now. Save and close. Now we can select the pattern here and delete that, because we're going to place this using repeat patterns, but we need to draw boundaries first. So I'm going to click on Draw Boundary, and from the head of my machine, I'm going to click the 4 outside edges of the block, and when I've gotten to the start, I'm going to click diagonally up to the upper right corner, across, click in the upper left again, and down to lower right, and then press close drawing. This gives a center reference to this boundary so that I know how to place the block in the center of this. Then don't click exit drawing. I'm going to move right over to the second block and click the outside of that center of the log cabin, back down to the beginning, across diagonally to create the center X for this block. Now I can click on close and then exit drawing. So with these X's, we know where the center of the block is. So I'm going to click on the pattern in the project tab, click on repeat patterns, and change the point type to center. And see, it says click a point using head or mouse. See my dots, my snaps are on. I want to take snaps off. So I'm going to use my mouse and zoom in rather than trying to use the head of the machine, and click the point right here in the center. Now I'm going to click on again, and I can move right over to the second block, zoom in, click on that center, and now I've placed both blocks. I can click OK to close the setup, and then I can click on the pattern, use your F10 center reference handles, and using a corner square, move the pattern inside the boundary, and then select the second one and move it inside the boundary. One last tip before we stitch these out and roll our quilt to finish the bottom half. The project was set up with tie-offs of 7, and stitching echoes, the tie-offs can be pretty obvious. So one thing I like to do is to change tie-offs till 2. It gives an anchor, but they're not obvious. Joanne typically stitches with tie-offs off. Those are both options. But to change them from the default of the project, if you have tie-offs on, then select both patterns, click the eye, and then you can change the tie stitches here to 2 and save and close. Because we multi-selected these patterns, it changed it for both. So the tie-offs on that one are 2, and the tie-offs for this one are 2. We'll stitch these out and roll the quilt, and then we'll be back. So I've rolled the quilt, so we're at the bottom now, and I thought I would go back to the Stitch in the Ditch group to show you what I meant when I mentioned at the top that lining up the bottom and keeping the quilt square by using the Stitch in the Ditch lines is a great technique. I'm at the bottom. First I'm going to line up my crosshairs, put my machine head right in the bottom corner of the inside border, and you'll see that I had success in rolling. It's a small piece, but I'm right on that same Stitch in the Ditch line that I had stitched at the top. I'm going to go back over and make sure that this seam line on this side also lines up, and I'm right on this side as well. So when I roll, this is typically what I do when I have Stitch in the Ditch lines to keep me straight. Just another tip on helping to keep quilts square. So we're ready to do the bottom 3-inch border, and I'll run quickly through the setup box for a bottom border. We're going to first select the corner pattern, hold our control key down on our keyboard, select the repeats, and click on border corner, and we'll click the box for the bottom. Now the only thing that clicking that box does is it changes the images in the display box so that you can see where you're supposed to click. So you'll see the star there, and like before, click upper left outer corner. Now this is up at the pickup bar. It does not have to be where the last pattern ended. Click it right up at the pickup bar. So upper left outer, upper right outer, and you see the stars moving. Now at the bottom we want to click the actual bottom right corner and then the bottom left corner. Now it says click upper left inner corner all the way to the pickup bar. Click that inside upper left, then the upper right. Come down and click that actual inside corner on the right, and then again on the left. It asks for your border length, and the length that you put in is the same as you put in at the top. And it was 33 inches that we used at the top, and Creative Studio fits those patterns in there, and we can say OK to close our setup box. Now what we want to do is to make sure that our start and ending patterns match up to the patterns that we have already quilted. Putting the machine head over on the right hand side at the very spot where the last pattern stitched, and I would select these two repeats, and you can adjust the difference over the two patterns instead of adjusting one. Then move your machine head over to the right hand side and line up with the last stitch on the left side. Select those two repeats and move that down. You can turn on F11 and get that to match right up at that crosshair. Now if you need to make any other adjustments to bring them closer, then you can adjust the patterns and then recheck to make sure that your patterns are all connected so that it sews continuous. And like I mentioned on the top, if you're using batting that might cause extra shrinkage, or if this was a bigger quilt, then you can certainly take the patterns on the left hand side and toggle them as sewn, sew part, check with new boundaries and crosshairs, and make any adjustments and then stitch the balance. So we'll make the final adjustments here, stitch these out, and then we'll move on to the bottom two center blocks.
Now that we've got our stitch in the ditch done on the bottom, we have the outside and the inside little apply borders done, and we have the 3-inch border done. We've made sure that our quilt is nice and straight. So we're going to move on to these two bottom log cabin wedges right down here, and that's all that we have left to quilt once we put the inside block pattern in. So I'm going back to my wedge quilt group. I have done a relocate and relocated to this point right here on this pattern, just to give myself a visual of what these patterns look like and where they're located. I've drawn a boundary the same way that I did at the top, making sure that I put these little click marks in here to be able to see where my seam line is. So I am simply going to select my pattern. Now with the head of the machine, what I will do is go to draw pattern, and I will make sure that my snaps are off. And once again, I want to place the center patterns first, the ones that go to the center. So I'm going to click this pattern into place. And sometimes it's a little difficult to know where you're supposed to start clicking, But with this one, I'm looking at the point of this pattern and where I want the point of the pattern to be. I want it to be in the center. So I'm going to start at the top left, and I'm going to go down to the bottom right of that first block, and then I'm going to go up to the upper right of the second block. I'm going to once again do the same thing that I did with the top patterns. I am going to go to F8, and I am going to just move those patterns right into that boundary the way that they need to be. I'm going to quilt these out. Then once I have quilted these patterns out, I'm going to go back to my pattern, which is still selected. I'm going to do draw pattern, and with the head of my machine, I'm going to click in the next patterns that I need to place. And because I want the point of the pattern to be in this lower right corner, then I'm going to click in a clockwise direction. I'm going to select the pattern, and I am going to place that pattern, select this one, adjust it ever so slightly. I would once again draw these center 6-inch boundaries to make sure that the patterns are located where they need to be. Then we just have to put in our center block. Before I completely leave the wedges, I wanted to give you just a little tip, because sometimes it might confuse you when you're selecting a triangle pattern. I'm going to select what I think is the one on the bottom left, and when I left click on that, it selects the one on the top of that particular square. Triangles select in a square handle fashion. In other words, they select just like a block does. So if you are scrolled in really close and you are trying to adjust, for instance, this little corner right here, pay attention please that even though you have handles, this pattern is not selected. This pattern is selected that is in the top. So you may have to click again to be able to adjust that. And a lot of times that's a little bit confusing. The other thing that I want to show you is if your little ends of your feathers were up into this 6-inch boundary, the best way to get them out of there and not break that connection is to go to your square gray handle in the top right. Because if I hold down the left mouse key and I push that ever so slightly, you see how it's moving those feathers out of the way? That's the one that you want to use to adjust those patterns. Anything else is going to break the connection or it's going to distort them. So that was just a couple of little tips that I wanted to leave you with before we left the wedge pattern.
We found this was a really fun project and really cute as well. Whether you do a 2-color or a more traditional colored log cabin block, these patterns will translate well. They'll also translate well to customer quilts or a bigger quilt. And here's a layout of, instead of 4 blocks, there are 24 blocks, which makes it a twin size 60 by 84 using the same sized borders. So we hope you enjoy it and can't wait to see your finished quilts.